Westminster, 2001. The streets were hushed that night, the lamps casting long golden streaks across slick cobblestones as the city exhaled into sleep. She walked alone, just blocks from home, her steps light, certain, until they weren't heard again. For days, then years, her name echoed faintly through police reports, cold file drawers, and the private grief of a family who never stopped asking why. Time buried her story beneath London's endless noise, but it never erased it. Then, this year, after 24 years of silence, detectives returned, not with more questions, but with an arrest warrant. The man they sought lived among them all along. For 2 decades, her name was whispered like an unfinished sentence. Until now. This is how Westminster's most chilling mystery was finally solved. In the early months of 2001, Westminster seemed untouched by the chaos that pulsed through the rest of London. While the capital roared with double-decker buses, honking taxis, and the constant clang of construction cranes, Westminster exhaled in quiet order. Cobbled lanes curled past Georgian terraces, their windows glowing with the steady light of habit. The air smelled of damp stone and bakery bread. The same postman greeted the same shopkeepers at the same hour each morning. It was a place where the cathedral bells marked time, and nothing ever seemed to change. Life unfolded here in neat, reassuring patterns. Commuters walked the same routes to the underground. Elderly couples fed pigeons near St. James's Park, and local grocers still wrote receipts by hand. People knew their neighbors' names, trusted the sound of their footsteps, and believed their streets were safe long after dark. She belonged to this world, young, driven, moving quietly through it like a soft brushstroke. Her days were measured and predictable, the kind of life no one expected to end in headlines, yet as Westminster moved to its familiar rhythms, something malignant watched from the periphery. It waited in the quiet corners and shadowed underpasses, invisible within the city's reassuring routines. No one noticed. No one could. That spring, beneath Westminster's polished calm, a predator was waiting. She was 26, with the kind of quiet confidence that made people instinctively trust her. Friends described her as gentle but determined, someone who spoke softly, yet never faded into the background. She had grown up in a modest terraced house in Surrey and moved to Westminster after university, drawn by the promise of opportunity and the slow charm of its tree-lined streets. Her name, spoken now in hushed tones, was once just another among the hundreds who hurried through Westminster Station each morning with takeaway coffees and half-formed dreams. She worked as a junior researcher at a local newspaper, a role she saw not as small but as a first foothold. Her desk was cluttered with notepads full of scribbled ideas, postcards from places she wanted to report from one day, and a battered old Olympus camera she carried everywhere. She dreamed of writing long-form pieces that mattered, stories that could change something, even if just for one person. She often stayed late, long after the newsroom lights dimmed, chasing threads no one else thought worth following. Outside of work, her world was small but rich. She had a close circle of friends, fellow graduates who gathered at a nearby pub every Thursday, where she always ordered ginger beer and laughed until her face flushed. On Sundays, she phoned her parents without fail. Her mother said she could hear her smile down the line. She volunteered twice a month at a youth reading program, sitting cross-legged on threadbare carpet while children leaned against her shoulder and sounded out their first words. She wrote everything down. Her journals were lined with pressed wildflowers, train tickets, and fragments of overheard conversations. Reading them now is like stepping into her private map of the world, tender, curious, and just beginning. There was no hint of fear in her pages, no premonition that her life would be interrupted mid-sentence. To those who knew her, she seemed untouchable in her ordinariness, woven safely into the fabric of the city. But even the most ordinary lives are fragile. All it takes is one unseen moment, one shadow that steps forward to tear everything apart. The night she vanished was unremarkable, the kind of gray March evening that London does so well, wet, dull, and forgettable. She had spent it at a friend's flat near Victoria Station, a quiet gathering over takeout boxes and cheap wine. Laughter curled softly around the edges of their conversation, their voices muffled by the rain that needled the windows. By 10:30, the group had thinned. She stood by the door with her coat half-buttoned, thanking her host with that small, earnest smile that made people want to hug her. She promised to text when she got home. She stepped out into the drizzle. The air smelled of wet stone and petrol, the streets shimmering under the thin sheen of rain. It was late enough that the rush-hour chaos had dissolved into emptiness. A few black cabs idled outside the station. Their drivers barely glanced up as she passed, head bowed against the wind. She walked south, away from the bright-lit chaos of Victoria, drawn toward the hushed streets she knew well. Her shoes clicked lightly on the pavement, a sound swallowed quickly by the wide, damp silence. Somewhere near the Thames embankment, she paused under a street lamp and pulled out her phone. The light gilded her face as she dialed her flatmate. The call lasted just under a minute. She said she was fine, she was on her way, and would be home in 20. Her voice was calm, maybe a little tired, the way voices sound when nights run longer than planned. At 10:57 p.m., a CCTV camera above a newsagent captured her walking past, coat collar turned up, umbrella unopened at her side. She was less than half a mile from her flat. The tape shows her adjusting her bag strap, glancing briefly over her shoulder, then looking forward again, quickening her pace. Nothing in her expression hints at fear. Minutes later, another camera picked her up at the corner of Horseferry Road. This time, she wasn't alone. A blurred figure trailed several paces behind her, just inside the pool of dim light. The camera's resolution was too poor to capture a face, only the broad shape of shoulders, the swing of a dark coat. The final image comes from a security camera outside an office building near the river. The drizzle had thickened into mist, curling around the yellow cones of the lamps. She crosses the frame at 11:09 p.m., stepping briefly into full view. Her hair clings damply to her cheek. Her stride is brisk, focused, as if she can already feel the warmth of home just ahead. Behind her, that same shadowy figure slips into view, and then, in the span of 2 frames, disappears again as she rounds the corner. That is where the trail ends. One moment, she is there, solid, certain, alive. The next, the street is empty, silent except for the soft hiss of rain. The camera keeps rolling, but she never reappears. And somewhere in that blank stretch of London night, she was gone. The morning after her disappearance began quietly, almost stubbornly normal. The rain had cleared from the night before, leaving Westminster's cobblestones slick and glistening in the pale autumn sun. But inside her tiny flat, the alarm clock droned unanswered. A mug of tea sat cold on the counter. Her bed untouched. By mid-morning, her absence had begun to ripple outward. A close friend, expecting a cheerful text about their dinner plans, instead got silence. Her employer called the landline when she didn't arrive at the office. Once, then twice, then again after lunch, each attempt more anxious than the last. No one had seen her since she left her friend's flat near Victoria Station the night before. Her parents, who lived an hour away, were the first to sense the gravity. They tried her mobile endlessly, their voices growing thinner with each voicemail. "Please, just call us back, please." When she failed to answer by late afternoon, her father drove into the city, checking the places she loved. The Riverside Cafe where she wrote in her journal, the bookshop on Horseferry Road, the benches overlooking the Thames. No trace. By evening, her friends gathered at her flat, the mood taut and disbelieving. They combed through her things, searching for clues. No packed bags, no missing passport, nothing to suggest she had left willingly. The first police officers arrived just after dusk, politely detached. They filled out a missing persons report, asking if she might be taking a break or needing space. The suggestion stung. Everyone knew she wasn't the kind to vanish. As the officers left, the street outside had gone unnervingly quiet. That was when the dread truly settled in. Something had happened to her, something none of them yet dared to name. The first official days of the investigation were marked less by action than by formality, forms filled, boxes ticked, and time quietly slipping away. The local police station logged her disappearance as a medium-risk missing adult, a categorization that allowed for caution, not urgency. Behind closed doors, officers muttered about breakups, burnout, and voluntary disappearances. She's an adult. She can walk away if she wants to. Her Family, meanwhile, could feel the seconds bleeding out. They begged the detectives to check CCTV from the streets around Victoria Station, where she had last been seen. The officers nodded, promised, and left. By the time anyone officially requested the footage, several crucial tapes had already been overwritten, a standard 7-day cycle that erased her final movements as though she had never walked there at all. Each day, the gap widened between what the family knew and what the system assumed. Her father plastered missing posters across Westminster's shop fronts and lampposts, while her mother phoned hospitals, shelters, and even morgues, her voice shaking with forced politeness. Friends organized search parties, combing the Thames embankment, the shadowed arches beneath railway bridges, and the narrow towpaths that wound through the city's forgotten corners. They returned exhausted and empty-handed. The police presence remained largely invisible. No press appeal went out that first week. No coordinated search grid was mapped. When journalists began calling the station, they were told there was no evidence of foul play, a phrase that felt like a dismissal, as though her disappearance were an inconvenience rather than an emergency. Frustration boiled over during a meeting at the station on the 10th day. Her brother slammed his fist on the table, demanding they treat the case as abduction. The senior inspector leaned back in his chair and said evenly, "There's nothing to suggest that. Sometimes people just leave." Those words echoed like a door slamming shut. While the bureaucracy stalled, the city quietly erased her. Posters tore in the rain, search volunteers dwindled, worn down by sleepless nights and silence. Leads trickled in, a possible sighting on a night bus, a handbag found near a park gate, but each was brushed aside, logged, and left to gather dust. Her family felt as though they were screaming into a void. Every hour without answers hardened into a sense of helplessness, and a creeping dread took root. If the system would not fight for her, who would? As days turned into weeks, the vacuum left by her absence filled with something darker, suspicion. With no clear leads, the community around Westminster began to quietly fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Her ex-boyfriend was the first to feel the shift. He had ended their relationship amicably months earlier, yet whispers curled through the streets like smoke. A shopkeeper claimed he'd seen them arguing near Victoria Station weeks before. Another swore he'd looked haunted in the days after she vanished. The police brought him in for questioning twice, keeping him for hours in a sterile room that smelled of old coffee. He emerged pale, defensive, and furious, but uncharged. Co-workers were quietly scrutinized next. Her colleagues at the publishing house found themselves answering detectives' pointed questions about office crushes, jealousies, and late-night walks home. The tone was clinical, but the effect was corrosive. People began avoiding eye contact in the break room. One co-worker later admitted she stopped walking alone to the tube, afraid of who might be looking too closely. In the absence of facts, stories bloomed like fungi in the damp. Secret affairs, secret debts, even the notion that she had staged her own disappearance to start over somewhere else. None of it made sense, yet it passed between neighbors in corner shops, laundromats, and pubs, traded in low voices over pints. Because this was 2001, there was no social media to amplify the noise, only the steady, face-to-face drip of rumor that worked its way into the cracks of the community. Neighbors who once shared spare keys now locked their doors. Strangers walking home at night quickened their pace, eyeing one another warily. Even her family, numb with grief, felt the sting. People they had known for years suddenly seemed guarded, watchful, as though wondering what the family wasn't saying. In that fog of paranoia, the search for the truth faltered. The investigation stalled, not for lack of effort, but because trust itself had begun to rot. Everyone was a suspect, and no one could agree on what kind of monster they were actually looking for. In the weeks following her disappearance, Westminster transformed. What had once been a backdrop of quiet dignity now seemed draped in unease. The absence of one young woman became a kind of ghost, lingering in every shop window and echoing across the cobblestones at dusk. Flyers bearing her face appeared first, black and white photocopies taped to lampposts, bus shelters, and the iron gates of Westminster Abbey. "Missing" was printed in thick block letters above her smiling eyes. Rain blurred the ink, but volunteers replaced them daily, refusing to let her image vanish as silently as she had. A vigil formed outside the abbey on the third Friday. It began with a handful of people, her friends, her parents clutching each other's hands, and strangers who had simply read about her in the paper. They stood in a trembling half-circle, candles flickering in the autumn wind. Someone read aloud from her favorite novel. Someone else prayed. By the next week, hundreds came, lining the abbey steps with wax pools and flowers. Church halls opened their doors, offering tea and quiet places to cry. Local pubs became information hubs by day and rumor mills by night. Market vendors who once chatted breezily now spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward alleys and shadowed corners. Mothers gripped their children's hands a little tighter on the walk to school. Commuters checked over their shoulders on the dim footpaths by the Thames. The response split the community down invisible lines. Some rallied, forming search groups, organizing poster drives, walking the embankments at night with torches despite the chill. They wore yellow ribbons on their coats as a symbol of hope. Others retreated. Doors that had always been open now stayed bolted. Neighbors who once shared Sunday roasts stopped speaking. Even the postman later said he felt eyes watching him from behind curtains as he passed. It was as if Westminster itself had inhaled and held its breath. The case was no longer just about one missing woman. It had become a wound in the heart of the neighborhood, raw and quietly bleeding. And though life outwardly went on, trains running, markets bustling, bells tolling from the abbey, an unspoken truth settled over the community like fog. Safety had been an illusion. Someone among them might have done this, and no one knew who to trust anymore. At first, every tip felt like a lifeline. The family clutched at them desperately, as though sheer hope might bend reality back into place. But one by one, each supposed breakthrough crumbled in their hands. The first came a week after she vanished. A jogger reported hearing a woman scream near St. James's Park just after midnight on the night she disappeared. Police scoured the area with sniffer dogs, combing through undergrowth and drainage ditches. They found nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a footprint. The lead dissolved into silence, leaving only tramp, lead grass, and hollow apologies. Then came the purse. A cyclist spotted it lying on the muddy embankment near the Thames, not far from where she had last been seen. Detectives swarmed the site. The purse was black leather, scuffed, soaked through. It wasn't hers. The name on the ID inside belonged to someone alive and well in Brighton. Still, for a few aching hours, her parents had braced themselves to see her belongings dredged from the river. Weeks later, an anonymous letter arrived at the family's home. The writer claimed she had run off to France with a secret lover, happy and safe. The note was signed with a name no one recognized. Investigators traced the postmark to a sorting office in Croydon but found nothing more. It was dismissed as a cruel prank, yet her mother reread it in the quiet hours of the night, torn between outrage and the aching wish for it to be true. Each false lead left them more hollow. Detectives' early urgency had dulled into weary bureaucracy. Callbacks slowed. Press coverage thinned. It felt, her sister later said, like screaming into a void. The world was moving on, but she was still gone, and the silence around her was becoming unbearable. Years passed, and with them went the urgency. In the beginning, her absence had been a living wound, raw, impossible to ignore. But as the calendar pages turned, what had once been an open crisis began to calcify into something else. An old tragedy people spoke of only when prompted, like a distant storm long since past. Her parents refused to let her name vanish. They wrote letters to every MP they could think of, pleading for renewed resources, fresh eyes on the case. They started petitions, stood outside Westminster Tube Station handing out leaflets to commuters who mostly averted their eyes. Sometimes people promised to sign, often they simply hurried past. The world had not been cruel, cuddly, just relentlessly busy. Inside the Metropolitan Police, her file changed hands as officers were promoted, reassigned, or retired. Each new detective inherited it with polite determination, only to move on weeks or months later, their optimism draining under the weight of time. The once urgent manhunt shrank to a cold case folder shelved among hundreds, its edges softening, its photos fading. Some evidence was misplaced. CCTV tapes from that week, the ones not copied early on, were overwritten. A single crucial fiber sample degraded in storage, rendered unusable by moisture. Birthdays came and went without her. On what would have been her 30th, her mother baked a small cake anyway, placing it on the kitchen table beside a framed photo of her laughing in the garden. No candles, no singing, just silence and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Her younger sister stopped bringing friends home. The house felt like a mausoleum of waiting. Even the media drifted away. Once reporters had called almost daily. Now, years might pass without a single inquiry. When the case was occasionally mentioned in retrospective Unsolved segments, her image appeared for a fleeting moment, then dissolved into another forgotten face, another unfinished story. Hope, her father once said, is like a match. It burns bright at first, fierce enough to light an entire room, but if nothing catches, it withers, smoke curling up from the blackened stick until it disappears. By the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, even their neighbors had stopped asking for updates. The posters were long gone from lampposts, the vigil candles had melted away. To most of Westminster, her story had become a footnote, a whispered cautionary tale about walking home alone after dark. But to her family, it was still everything, the absence around which their entire lives orbited. They no longer spoke of finding her alive, they only whispered about finding her at all. And as the world forgot her, the silence around her name grew heavier, more oppressive, like a sealed tomb. It began quietly, without headlines or fanfare, a subtle ripple disturbing years of still water. In early 2024, the Metropolitan Police quietly launched a specialist cold case review unit, tasked with revisiting some of London's most enduring mysteries. The unit was small, just 8 detectives and analysts tucked into a converted office near New Scotland Yard, but they carried something their predecessors had not: time, technology, and a mandate to dig through forgotten darkness. Among the cases flagged was hers. Her name appeared on a spreadsheet labeled Unresolved Female Disappearances, 1990-2010. It was almost clinical, a data point buried among dozens of others. But to Detective Inspector Eleanor Marks, newly assigned to the unit, that name caught and held like a thorn. She had been a junior constable in Westminster when the young woman vanished in 2001. She remembered the posters, the vigils, the gnawing sense that something had been missed. Marks pulled the case file from storage. The folder was swollen and discolored, its once crisp pages softened from countless hands. She spread it across her desk and began the slow work of rebuilding the story from scratch, logging every scrap of evidence into a new digital archive. That same spring, a civilian volunteer joined the effort, a genealogist named Daniel Price, who had made a reputation helping American police identify unknown remains through familial DNA. He had a calm, almost monastic presence, and he spent hours combing through the Metropolitan Police's neglected biological evidence vaults. One afternoon, he discovered that a set of partial DNA swabs, collected from a cigarette butt found near the scene in 2001, had never been fully profiled using modern technique. The original analysis had been too degraded for results, but Price believed new sequencing methods could extract viable data. Meanwhile, a separate breakthrough came from an unexpected source: digital restoration. A young technician named Lila Bennett had been experimenting with an AI-based enhancement tool designed to stabilize old CCTV footage. On a whim, she fed in a batch of low-resolution tapes from Westminster traffic cameras recorded the night of the disappearance, tapes once thought useless and largely ignored. The system took hours to reconstruct each frame, interpolating missing data pixel by pixel. What emerged was startling. A fleeting silhouette, barely discernible on the original tapes, walking several paces behind the victim near the Thames embankment. A tall figure in a hooded coat, their gait oddly deliberate. It was just a shadow, and it proved nothing on its own, but it was more than the case had offered in 2 decades. For the first time in years, the investigation room felt charged with energy. Marks, Price, and Bennett worked late into the night, piecing fragments together like archaeologists excavating a buried world. They spoke in quiet tones, almost afraid to break the fragile spell of momentum. Outside, London roared with its usual chaos, unaware that a ghost from 2001 was stirring back to life. And for the family, still clutching her photograph in fading frames, the call came one gray March morning. The police were reopening her case. After 23 years, something was finally moving. The moment itself came quietly, like the first crack in ice. By early 2025, the Cold Case Review had transformed from a side project into a quiet obsession. Weeks of late nights blurred into each other as D.I. Marks and her small team re-examined every scrap of evidence. The cigarette butt retrieved near the Thames all those years ago, once dismissed as too degraded, had been sent to a cutting-edge forensic lab in Manchester. The results came back on a wet January morning, a full genetic profile, clean and clear. When the notification pinged on Marks's screen, she stared at it in disbelief. The sample had matched an entry in the National DNA database. Not a stranger, but a man who had once been questioned and released in 2001, a maintenance contractor named Thomas Hale. Back then, he'd claimed to have seen nothing, just happened to be walking home from a late job. He had no prior record then, but years later, he had been quietly entered into the database after a domestic assault conviction. The match snapped 2 decades of suspended disbelief. Hale had lived less than a mile from where the victim vanished. Almost simultaneously, the enhanced CCTV from 2001, now painstakingly stabilized by Bennett's software, revealed something chilling. In the moments before the victim disappeared from view, a tall figure in a hooded coat walked deliberately behind her, their stride syncing eerily with hers. When the footage zoomed and filtered, a faint glint appeared at their wrist. A keyring, metallic and distinctive, the same kind Hale had been known to carry for his maintenance jobs. It was enough for a warrant. In February, officers obtained authorization to search a storage unit registered to Hale in Southwark, a rust-colored corrugated metal structure tucked behind a crumbling industrial estate. He had rented it continuously since 2000. The lock had been changed only once. The search team arrived at dawn. Rain slicked the concrete, muting the crunch of their boots. They worked in silence, as if the air itself understood the gravity of what might be about to surface. Marks stood by the door, jaw tight, watching as bolt cutters bit through the rusted padlock. When the door finally screeched open, a wave of stale air pushed outward, cold, dry, heavy with the smell of long undisturbed earth. The interior was dim, crowded with old paint tins, coils of wire, and cracked plastic crates. Then, at the far end, beneath a stack of dust-caked tarpaulins, they saw it. A shallow wooden trunk, its edges warped by damp. Gloved hands lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of a life. And of a death. There was a small canvas backpack, faded blue, with a stitched patch of a daisy near the zip. Inside it were personal items, a compact mirror, a worn paperback novel, and a slim leather journal, its pages curled from moisture. The first page bore her name in looping handwriting. Beneath the pack, wrapped in discolored fabric, lay human remains. They were skeletal but unmistakably human, the delicate curve of a jaw, long strands of dark hair matted in the folds of the cloth. Nearby, a pair of scuffed black shoes lay neatly placed side by side, as though set down carefully and never touched again. For a moment, the team said nothing. The only sound was the soft hum of rain striking the tin roof above. Marks closed her eyes. 23 years of absence had just collapsed into a single, devastating presence. Forensics moved in with quiet precision, photographing, cataloging, sealing each item. Every motion was reverent, as if they were unearthing not just evidence, but a person, someone who had been denied her final dignity for more than 2 decades. Outside, the street was still gray and dripping when they carried the boxes out under plastic sheeting. No one watching would have guessed that history had just shifted. That night, in a small briefing room at New Scotland Yard, Marks placed the recovered journal on the table. She didn't open it. She simply rested her hand on its warped cover and whispered, "She's coming home." News of the discovery hit Westminster like a thunderclap. On a gray Monday morning in March 2025, the Metropolitan Police held a terse press conference outside New Scotland Yard. Cameras clicked furiously as DI Eleanor Marks stepped to the podium, flanked by stoic senior officers. She confirmed that human remains had been recovered from a private storage unit in Southways Park and that they were believed to be those of the woman who vanished in 2001. The words were spare, clinical, but their weight was seismic. Within hours, the story surged across every front page and news site. Satellite vans clustered outside the storage facility. Helicopters buzzed overhead, chasing any scrap of footage. Reporters descended on Westminster, filling the narrow streets around her old flat, shoving microphones at stunned neighbors who had barely spoken her name aloud in years. Suddenly, the case that had been a ghost was everywhere. Behind closed doors, the investigation roared back to life. Detectives who had quietly set aside her file long ago were summoned from retirement for interviews. A handful agreed, their faces lined with years and guilt. Some admitted they'd always suspected Hale but lacked the evidence. Others said they had been discouraged from pursuing him. Too little proof, too much pressure to clear the books. Now, with a confirmed DNA match and recovered belongings, hesitation evaporated. Every decision made in 2001 was scrutinized with surgical precision. Why had certain leads been dropped? Why had the storage unit never been checked? Old witnesses were tracked down and re-interviewed. Friends from the night she vanished, the shopkeeper who'd seen her walking home, even Hale's former co-workers, who now described him as oddly possessive and quiet but watching. Questions exploded in the press. How could such damning evidence sit undiscovered for 2 decades? How had a man already questioned in the original investigation slipped so cleanly from view? The same tabloids that once painted her as a runaway now demanded accountability, their headlines dripping with outrage. How did they miss him? For her family, it was surreal. For years they had begged for urgency, only to be dismissed and told to be patient. Now the same institution, ends that had once gone silent, were moving with relentless speed. It was as if the whole machine had finally woken up, loud, unstoppable, almost frantic to make up for lost time. Westminster, once muted by grief and forgetfulness, pulsed with the noise of consequence. After 24 years of silence, the hunt had begun again, and this time no one would be allowed to look away. The name dropped like a stone into still water, and the ripples were immediate, violent. Daniel Hall. When police confirmed the suspect's identity at a hastily arranged evening press conference, the crowd outside New Scotland Yard erupted into gasps and shouting. Within seconds, the name was flashing across every television screen, every phone, every social feed in the country. Commentators spoke in stunned, halting tones. Reporters tripped over their own words. Some even paused mid-broadcast, visibly shaken, muttering, "It can't be him." Because everyone in Westminster knew Daniel Hale. He wasn't a shadowy drifter or a forgotten name on a dusty file. He was one of them. A long-time local council worker, Hale had been the smiling face at community meetings, the soft-spoken man who organized fire safety seminars at schools and pushed for better street lighting around housing estates. He'd spent years volunteering for women's safety campaigns, handing out reflective armbands to joggers and distributing leaflets on how to protect yourself from harassment. He had been, in the public eye, the embodiment of civic duty, and now police said he had murdered her. The revelation detonated across Westminster like a bomb. Within hours, journalists crowded outside his modest terraced house, filming every brick, every potted plant. Vans blocked the narrow street, their cables snaking over garden fences. Neighbors stood on their porches in slippers and dressing gowns, shaking their heads as if trying to wake from a dream. I can't believe it," stammered an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. "He mowed my lawn when my husband passed. He was kind." A young mother, clutching, her toddler on her hip, said through tears, "We trusted him. He gave a talk at my daughter's school about stranger danger. My God, all this time." The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself for many, because Hale hadn't been a monster lurking on the fringes. He'd been woven into the fabric of their lives, and now that fabric was unraveling. Police confirmed that belongings recovered from the storage unit included the missing woman's necklace, still clasped shut, strands of her hair tangled in the chain. They found her purse, ID, and scraps of clothing sealed in plastic tubs, items Hale had meticulously kept, hidden just miles from her old flat. DNA linked it all beyond doubt. What chilled investigators most was how normal his life had appeared in the decades since. No criminal record, no complaints. He'd received a local service award in 2017. He spent weekends tending his allotment and walking his dog. But buried beneath that quiet exterior, detectives now alleged, was something darker. Years of secret stalking, fixation, and control. Anonymous sources within the inquiry revealed that Hale's name had appeared briefly in the original 2001 investigation, as an acquaintance who lived nearby, but he was quickly dismissed as low risk. Now, digital forensics uncovered old journals from his home computer containing disturbing entries, fragmented descriptions of women he followed, coded references to keeping her close, and chilling sketches of her face. The press tore into the story with feral hunger. Talk shows buzzed with experts dissecting how someone could live a double life so seamlessly. Columnists denounced institutional blindness. Headlines screamed, "The predator next door," council hero unmasked as killer. We let him walk among us. For the victim's family, the news was both a vindication and a fresh wound. They had warned police about Hale in the EA. Early days. No one had listened. Now the world was listening, and no one could unhear it. The arrest was as sudden as it was silent. At 5:12 a.m., while Westminster still slept under a gauze of winter mist, unmarked police cars rolled down Hale's street in eerie formation. Officers in plain clothes approached his door, their boots soundless on the frosted pavement. A tactical team breached the back garden gate. Inside, Hale was making tea. He didn't flinch when they entered. No shouts, no struggle. He simply placed the kettle back on its base, turned, and said in an even voice, "I was wondering when you'd come." The nation watched as he was led down the front steps in handcuffs, head bowed, the camera flashes lighting his face like a strobe. Crowds of onlookers had gathered within minutes, drawn by sirens and rumors, their anger rising as the realization sank in. "Monster!" someone screamed from across the barricade. "He lived here all these years," another cried. Reporters jostled for position, shouting questions he ignored. He was bundled into a van and driven away under armed escort, the blue light slicing through the gray dawn. At the Metropolitan Police headquarters, Hale sat alone in the interview room, hands folded, posture relaxed, eyes empty. Detectives expected rage, denial, pleading. Instead, they got calculation. For hours they laid out the evidence, the hair sample match, the recovered belongings, the enhanced CCTV still showing his figure trailing her that night. They showed him the journals, the obsessive notes. Hale didn't blink. "People disappear all the time," he murmured once, almost to himself. When pressed on the storage unit, he smiled faintly. "I keep things," he said. "Memories." That was as close as he came to confession. Eventually, he invoked his solicitor and went silent, but his calm unnerved even veteran detectives. One later described the room as feeling airless, like he had vacuumed out all humanity from it. By the time Hale stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, the case had become a national obsession. Crowds lined the streets. People queued overnight for seats in the public gallery. Security was intense. Bomb sweeps, sniffer dogs, armed police stationed on the roof. The courtroom buzzed with barely contained emotion. The prosecution opened with a cold, methodical timeline. How Hale stalked her movements, how he followed her from the pub that night, how he lured her away. They described the discovery of her remains, the physical evidence tying him to her, the journal entries, and the decades-long deception that let him evade suspicion. "This was not a moment of madness," the prosecutor said, voice cutting through the chamber. "This was predation, planned and patient, a performance of normalcy wrapped around a hollow core." The jury watched Hale's face throughout. It barely moved. Hale's barrister painted a different picture of a man suffering from untreated dissociative mental illness, of fragmented memory and delusions. He argued that the journals were fantasy, not fact, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the remains could not definitively prove how she died or when. The defense tried to sow doubt. They suggested police tunnel vision, media pressure, contamination of old evidence. But cracks showed. Under cross-examination, Hale's composure occasionally slipped. When asked directly if he had loved her, he answered too quickly, "She belonged with me," and the gallery gasped audibly. Then came the moment that seared itself into everyone's memory. Her mother on the witness stand. Her hands trembled as she held up a photo. Her daughter at 19, laughing in a sunlit garden. "She was light," she whispered. "You took that from us. You kept her like a thing, and you let us rot in not knowing." Her voice broke, and the courtroom fell to a perfect, unbearable silence. Even the judge lowered his eyes. That the minute of raw grief, carried more weight than all the charts and timelines. As the trial stretched into weeks, public debate grew fevered. Commentators worried about the case relying on aged evidence and circumstantial reconstruction. Legal analysts speculated that a single juror's doubt could collapse everything. Hale sat motionless throughout, as if the proceedings didn't concern him. When the jury retired, the world seemed to hold its breath. For 27 hours, no one knew. Families camped outside the court. News channels broadcast nothing else. Then at 3:41 p.m. on the 12th day, the jury returned. "Guilty," the foreman said, voice steady, "on all counts." The gallery erupted, sobs, cheers, gasps, as Hale stood expressionless, eyes fixed somewhere above the judge's head, as though none of it touched him. Justice at last, but it felt less like victory and more like release. The spell had broken. The performance was over. The courtroom was hushed when the judge returned, black robes trailing like shadows across the polished wood. Hale stood impassive in the dock, flanked by guards, as though the weeks of testimony and grief had passed through him without leaving a trace. The judge's voice, when it came, was steady but laden with weight. "You lived among this community as a trusted figure, a colleague, a neighbor, a supposed protector," she said. "All the while you carried a secret of unspeakable cruelty. You robbed a young woman of her future, and you robbed her family of decades of peace. The court finds you guilty of murder and concealment, and you will serve a whole life sentence. You will never be released." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, a single collective exhale after years of held breath. Hale didn't move. He didn't flinch when the gavel fell. The guards led him away in silence, the door clanging shut behind him with a finality that echoed like the closing of a tomb. At the courthouse steps, her parents stood hand in hand, framed by microphones and a sea of cameras. Her father read from a prepared statement, his voice cracking on every third word. "We waited 24 years to know what became of our daughter," he said. "We missed her birthdays, her laughter, her wedding that never came. Today, we finally know. It doesn't bring her back, but it brings her home." Her mother could not speak. She simply held her daughter's photo to her chest, eyes closed as tears ran silently down her cheeks. That night, Westminster fell quiet. Where she was last seen, someone left a bouquet of white lilies against the old brick wall. By morning, there were dozens. Flowers, candles, handwritten notes. Commuters paused on their way to work to stand in silence, as if the air itself was paying respect. Local churches rang their bells. A market stall displayed her photo alongside a small sign. She mattered. Neighbors who once whispered suspicion now spoke softly of forgiveness, of learning to trust again. There was no celebration, only release, like a storm finally passing after decades of gray skies. The case had consumed nearly a quarter-century. It had fractured trust, scarred families, and haunted a city that prided itself on safety and dignity. Now, at last, there was an ending, not the one anyone wanted, but an ending all the same. The family returned home clutching the court's official documents in one hand and each other's hands in the other. They would never be whole, but they would be free from wondering. And on the quiet Westminster street where she vanished, the flowers kept coming, as if the city was finally trying to say the words it hadn't been able to for 24 long years. We remember you. We always will. In the weeks after the sentencing, as Westminster slowly exhaled and the media frenzy ebbed, a quieter conversation began to ripple through Britain. It was no longer about one man's crimes or one woman's fate. It was about how an entire system designed to protect could let silence stretch across 24 years before finally breaking. Her case became a mirror, forcing the country to confront uncomfortable truths. Back in 2001, when her family first reported her missing, they were met with the familiar shrug of procedure. She was probably taking time away, they were told. That assumption, that an adult absence is voluntary until proven otherwise, is etched deep into institutional thinking. It saves resources, yes, but it costs lives. Her case showed how lethal those first 48 hours can be when urgency is delayed. Witnesses forget. CCTV tapes are overwritten. Leads go cold. By the time police accepted she was in danger, the trail had already faded to ash. It was not malice, but complacency. And complacency can be just as deadly. As years passed, her disappearance became background noise, a headline from another era. Files gathered dust. Detectives retired. The people who once marched in candlelit vigils stopped speaking her name. This, too, is part of the danger. When time numbs urgency, unresolved grief quietly calcifies into something even more stubborn than sorrow: indifference. Her family fought against that erosion for decades. They became archivists of their own heartbreak, preserving her image, her voice, her handwriting, because they knew that if they stopped, the world would stop too. Their persistence was not just love, it was defiance. What finally cracked the silence was not chance, but change. New DNA sequencing methods made a single hair, saved almost by accident, readable again. Old CCTV tapes, long thought useless, were digitized and enhanced, by modern software. A volunteer genealogist, unpaid, working from a kitchen table, stitched together fragments of data that the system had missed. Her case is now held up in policing circles as proof that no cold case is truly unsolvable if technology is paired with persistence. The lesson is not just that science advanced, it's that someone bothered to look again. Her story leaves behind a chilling question: how many others are still missing because their cases were quietly set aside, dismissed as runaways, or lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy? Britain prides itself on fairness, on compassion, but fairness requires vigilance, and compassion means refusing to let someone vanish into paperwork. The cost of waiting for certainty can be irreversible. Her case is now taught in training seminars as a cautionary tale. Treat every disappearance as real, as urgent, as someone's whole world collapsing, because it is. As Westminster tries to stitch itself back together, one thing has become clear. Justice is not just about verdicts and sentences. It is about memory, about refusing to let silence win. Her name, once whispered like an unfinished sentence, now carries the weight of reform. She did not come home, but her story might yet save others. Thank you for staying with this story, for walking alongside her, through the long silence and into the truth. For 24 years, her name faded from headlines, from public memory, even from the walls of the police station where her file sat unopened. Yet her family never stopped speaking her name. Their devotion, their refusal to let her disappear completely, is why we are able to speak it again today, not as a question, but as a person. Justice came late, but it came, and in that there is something worth holding on to: the belief that even the coldest silence can be broken, that forgotten voices can still be heard, if we choose to listen. If this story moved you, please consider supporting organizations that search for the missing and advocate for their families. Your awareness, your voice, can be part of the chain that brings someone else home. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that refuse to let the lost be forgotten. Please subscribe and join us here. Every view, every share, helps these stories reach the light. Her voice was silent for 24 years. Now, we must make sure it's never forgotten again.